The man at my door wore a badge, a bulletproof vest, and a smirk that screamed trouble. "You're in violation of multiple HOA ordinances," he barked. I raised an eyebrow. "Funny, I don't have an HOA." He stepped forward like he expected me to flinch. Big mistake. I flipped open my wallet, revealing my own badge. FBI. "Impersonating law enforcement is a federal crime," I said calmly. "Want to try again?" His face went pale. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a power trip. It was a full-blown conspiracy. Want to hear how a fake HOA tried to arrest a federal agent? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping real-life stories. The morning sun spilled across the street like nothing had ever happened, but I knew better. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a battleground. The trimmed hedges and perfectly painted fences were just a mask. Behind those white pickets, fear festered, and at the heart of it stood one woman, Karen. I'd dealt with organized crime, terrorist cells, and drug rings, but this was personal. A fake HOA police force roaming the neighborhood, slapping fines on lawn lengths and mailbox designs, and Karen, our self-declared neighborhood queen, pulling the strings, hiding behind a bogus badge and an even more bogus sense of authority. And now that I'd survived the storm and brought her down, you'd think that was the end. But no, that was just the beginning of the reckoning. Tamara was the first to thank me, a quiet gratitude that lingered longer than words. She came to my door the day after Karen's arrest, carrying a plate of cookies like we were suddenly in one of those suburban fairy tales again. But behind her polite smile was exhaustion, a residue from the fear she'd lived under. "You really did it," she said, hands shaking just a little as she passed me the plate. "Only because you were brave enough to stand up," I replied. "I almost didn't," she said, eyes misting. "I was afraid they'd come for me next." She wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years came by. Apologies, awkward handshakes, guilty glances. They'd gone along with Karen's rules out of fear. One even admitted he paid over $1,000 in fake citations just to be left alone. The FBI review wrapped with a surprising lack of fanfare. Internal Affairs cleared my record and quietly shelved the complaints that had been piled up against me, thanks to the evidence I'd provided and Alvarez's report. My supervisor, once distant and skeptical, now regarded me with some thing approaching respect. "You were right," she said during our final sit-down. "We should have listened sooner." Maybe, but I understood why they hadn't. Karen had played a long game, one that relied on image and control. She manipulated systems, bent people's perceptions, and wielded fear like a scalpel. She didn't need real power, just the illusion of it. But illusions crack under pressure. A week later, the real HOA board held an emergency meeting. Unlike Karen's theatrical assemblies, this one was quiet and somber. Alvarez was there, along with a few community leaders. They discussed restitution for those who'd been extorted, a full audit of HOA finances, and steps to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. I sat near the back, content to watch, until someone asked me to speak. I stood slowly, heart pounding, not with fear, but with responsibility. These people needed more than justice. They needed closure. "She fooled a lot of us," I began. "Not because we're stupid or weak, but because fear is a powerful thing. She made us feel isolated, like we had no choice. That ends now." Heads nodded. A few people clapped. The board chair smiled, a real smile, and asked if I'd be willing to help with the reform committee. I wasn't sure at first. I didn't want to be the new face of neighborhood politics, but then I thought of Tamara, of the elderly couple down the block who'd stopped going outside because of Karen's patrols, of the kids who'd been told not to ride their bikes because it was against policy. They needed someone to look out for them, someone who wouldn't turn a blind eye when power was abused. I nodded. "Yeah, I'll help." As the meeting adjourned, I stepped outside into the fading daylight. The neighborhood looked the same, but it felt different. The tightness in my chest, the tension that had haunted every trip to the mailbox, every troll around the block, it was gone, replaced with something unfamiliar. Hope. But Karen's arrest hadn't answered all the questions. Who helped her pull this off? Who were the fake officers that vanished the night of the meeting? What connections did she really have at the bureau? I had answers to find and a trail to follow. Because while the curtain had closed on Karen's neighborhood reign, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. I didn't sleep well after that meeting. Even with Karen in custody and her operation exposed, my instincts refused to rest. Years in the FBI had taught me that dismantling a scheme like hers was only the visible layer. The real rot always went deeper. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee and my laptop open. I started digging. Karen's phony HOA police had operated under the name Neighborhood Protection Services, a generic title, vague enough to sound legitimate but impossible to trace at first glance. The business registration was out of state, filed through a virtual office address. No phone number, no staff list, no website. Classic cover operation. I pulled up the plate number Alvarez had written down during the confrontation. The vehicle was registered to a shell company, same state, different name, Civic Oversight Solutions. Another vague title, another dead end. But something about that name rang a bell. I flipped through one of my old case files, an operation we'd once run on private security firms contracted by shady landlords. Sure enough, Civic Oversight Solutions had been flagged in a background search connected to an illegal eviction ring in Nevada. Interesting. Karen wasn't smart enough to orchestrate that kind of network on her own. She had a contact, someone feeding her access, maybe even helping her fund this entire scheme. I sent a quiet request to a former colleague in cybercrimes. No official trace, just a favor. He owed me one. I asked him to look into the corporate ties between those shell companies and whether any financials showed unusual activity. While I waited, I walked the block. Not out of paranoia, at least that's what I told myself, but just to keep eyes on the neighborhood. People were still skittish. Some waved hesitantly. A few avoided eye contact altogether. It would take time for trust to rebuild. Tamara spotted me and jogged across the street, a nervous smile on her face. "They dropped off another letter," she said, holding out a white envelope. "No return address." I took it carefully, heart rate picking up. The flap wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You made a mistake. You're not done yet." No signature, no threats, but the meaning was clear. "Did you see who left it?" She shook her head. "It was just there this morning, same time the regular mail came." I nodded and stuffed the note into my coat pocket. Whoever was behind this wanted me rattled. Too late for that. That afternoon, my cyber friend pinged me back. His email was short and laced with caution. "You're looking at a spider web. Multiple fake LLCs registered under the same agent in D.C. The common name, Brett Lansing." I froze. Deputy Director Brett Lansing, Karen's uncle. No wonder Karen had been so confident. She had protection at the highest levels, or thought she did. I stared at the screen, tension winding through me. Lansing had managed to keep his name clean for decades, but if these connections held, he wasn't just aware of her scam. He was part of it. And now I was stepping into federal waters. I knew better than to act on this without solid proof. Allegations alone wouldn't hold, not against someone like Lansing. But if I could tie the money trail from the shell companies to Karen and back to him, this wouldn't just be a neighborhood scandal anymore. This would be federal corruption. I started building a folder. Financial statements, cross-referenced addresses, timestamps, a timeline of the HOA citations, and the dates the fake officers were seen patrolling. I even collected testimonials from neighbors who'd received those bogus fines, many of them now willing to talk. At the bottom of it all was Karen's voice at the community center. "We have friends in high places." I believed her now. The next step was risky. I needed someone inside the bureau who wasn't compromised, someone who could look into Lansing without tipping him off. That night, I called in another favor, this one costlier. "Agent Howell," the voice on the line said after a few rings. "Hey, it's me. I need help with a sensitive investigation. Off the books for now." There was a pause, then a cautious reply. "This about Lansing?" I didn't answer. "That's what I thought," Howell said. "I've been hearing whispers. You're not the only one asking questions." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "There's chatter that someone's been scrubbing files, internal audits, security footage, even employee histories, quietly but thorough, covering their tracks." "Exactly. Be careful." I ended the call and sat there in the dark, mind racing. This wasn't just about a power-hungry woman and her fake HOA army anymore. Karen had been a tool, ambitious, manipulative, and dangerous, but still a pawn. The king was Lansing, and I had just put myself directly in his crosshairs. I knew I had to move carefully. Taking on a deputy director of the FBI wasn't just career suicide. It was the kind of play that got you buried under layers of red tape, anonymous complaints, or worse. But now I had a lead, and leads were meant to be followed. I started by revisiting every interaction I'd ever had with Lansing. It wasn't many, but he'd always had a reputation for being untouchable, impeccably dressed, and eerily composed, the kind of man who smiled just wide enough to hide the blade in your back. I'd always suspected he had skeletons. I just didn't think one of them would show up on my front lawn dressed like a fake cop. The first real break came when I checked Alvarez's incident report. He'd noted that Karen had tried to call someone after she was cuffed, but the call never connected. Standard booking procedure meant her phone had been confiscated, but the logs showed she'd tried dialing a number with a DC area code. I reached out to Howell again. "Any way you can trace a number dialed from a confiscated phone?" He groaned. "I'm going to pretend you didn't just ask that. Just a yes or no." A pause. "Off the record?" "Yes, but not without risk." "Take the risk." Hours later, Howell called me back. "You're not going to like it," he said. "Try me. That number belongs to a burner phone registered under a false name, but the cell tower hits. They trace back to Quantico. Building C." I felt my stomach drop. Building C was executive administration, Lansing's territory. It was all coming together. Karen had built a fake HOA police force to exert control, sure, but it had also been a testbed, a microcosm, a way to launder money, enforce compliance, and push a narrative. Lansing had been using his niece to prototype something bigger, something darker, and now that it was exposed, he was cleaning house, which meant I was on the list. I called Tamara the next morning. "Don't answer the door unless you know who it is. And if anyone calls asking questions about me, you hang up. You think they'll come back? They will, not in uniform, not like before, but they'll come." That afternoon, I caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar sedan parked 2 houses down from mine. Tinted windows, no front plate. I didn't approach it, just noted the make, model, and time. The next day, it was back. Different spot, same car. I wasn't just being watched, I was being measured. They wanted to know what I'd do next. I doubled down on documentation. Every file I'd pulled, every statement I'd collected, I made encrypted copies and stored them across multiple drives, hiding them in places no one would think to look. A USB drive inside a hollowed-out light socket, an SD card taped behind a bathroom mirror. One I mailed to an old friend with instructions to open only if I went dark. Paranoia wasn't a choice anymore. It was strategy. Then I got another message. This time, it wasn't a note in the mailbox. It was a voicemail. "No caller ID. You're dancing on a wire, agent. One wrong step and you fall." The voice was scrambled, but the implication was clear. Lansing, or someone working for him, knew I was getting close. The heat was building. I met with Alvarez under the pretense of grabbing coffee. We sat at an outdoor cafe, keeping conversation casual. "Anything strange come up after Karen's arrest?" I asked between sips. He nodded slightly. "Someone from DC requested her transfer paperwork. Didn't go through local channels, just appeared in the system, quietly reassigned to federal custody 2 days after booking." I sat back. "Disappeared, you mean?" He nodded again. "They're silencing her," I muttered. "Or shielding her." Either way, it meant she wouldn't be testifying anytime soon, which made my mission harder. But not impossible. I decided to bait the hook. Late that night, I posted an anonymous tip on a federal whistleblower forum, an encrypted space used by intel and law enforcement insiders. I included vague details about a deputy director abusing federal resources to manipulate local law enforcement. Nothing direct, just enough to trigger interest. If Lansing was watching, he'd see it, and he'd react. The next morning, my FBI credentials were locked out. Email. Denied. Secure line. Dead. Access card. Deactivated. I didn't even get a call. Just silence. You'd ghosted me. This wasn't a suspension. It was exile. They were wiping me off the grid so I couldn't look deeper. But they didn't realize I'd already backed everything up. Already spread the evidence like breadcrumbs across trusted hands. They'd cut me off from the bureau. Now, I was on my own. And that made me more dangerous than ever. Being frozen out of the bureau wasn't the end. It was a beginning. I wasn't naive enough to think the FBI was all saints and stripes. Bureaucracies that big always had rot in their foundation. But this was targeted, personal. Lansing wasn't just trying to cover Karen's tracks. He was scrubbing me clean from the record, hoping I'd vanish into the fog of internal confusion. But I'd been preparing for this possibility ever since I saw those fake zip ties on my porch. They'd wanted me scared. They'd wanted Tamara to feel isolated. Now I had nothing left to lose. And when you've got nothing to lose, people like Lansing should start sweating. I went dark, turned off my phone, pulled the battery, ditched it in a dumpster 3 towns over, bought a burner at a gas station using cash and a hat pulled low. No more texts, no more pings. If Lansing's crew wanted to track me, they'd have to work for it. My next move? Find leverage, not just against Karen, but against the machine behind her. I started reaching out, off-the-record calls to old contacts, people who owed me favors, or just plain hated Lansing enough to whisper what they knew. It was slow going, and most were too scared to talk. But one name came up twice. Roger Elston, former bureau analyst, quietly retired last year after what the files called a personal matter. Translation: something shady forced him out, and no one wanted to put it in writing. I found him in Arizona, living in a rundown house at the edge of the desert. He opened the door with a tired expression. Hair, messy, t-shirt stained with grease. "You're either a bill collector or someone who wants me dead," he said flatly. "I'm neither," I replied, holding up my badge. "Or at least I used to be. Can I come in?" He studied me for a moment, then stepped aside. "You got 5 minutes." His house smelled like coffee grounds and lost hope. Stacks of old case files littered the room, some marked classified, others with big black redaction bars scrawled across them. "I'm investigating Karen Lansing," I began. That got his attention. He slowly turned from the fridge. "The niece?" "Yeah, but more importantly, I'm looking into her uncle, your old boss." Roger barked a humorless laugh. "Figures. The one thing I swore I'd never touch again." "What happened?" He took a long sip of lukewarm coffee before answering. "Lansing ran a quiet op inside the bureau. Off-book surveillance, private data mining, targeting certain employees he saw as disruptive. Said it was about internal integrity, but it was really about power, leverage. He built dossiers on his enemies, blackmail material." I leaned in. "You were one of them?" He nodded. "I flagged one of his red flag searches. He found out, and the next week I was medically retired with a warning to keep my mouth shut." "You kept any of those files?" Roger gestured toward a battered metal filing cabinet. "Only the ones I knew he wouldn't risk chasing. Everything else? Burned before they could raid my place." It wasn't much, but it was a start. I scanned through what he had, mostly memos, old emails, and flagged queries. But tucked between them was gold. A signed directive from Lansing authorizing the use of third-party surveillance companies under the pretense of community safety programs. The name of one of those companies? Centurion Neighborhood Services, the same fake security outfit Karen's HOA police had operated under. My pulse jumped. With this document, I could prove Karen's group wasn't some rogue operation. It was part of a broader strategy cooked up inside the Bureau. A strategy Lansing was trying to scale, probably through other neighborhoods, maybe even city councils, HOAs, or corporate campuses. Control disguised as safety. I made copies and hid them on encrypted drives, then thanked Roger and promised to keep his name out of things. As I headed back to my car, the burner phone buzzed. One new text. "You were warned. Now we make an example." Attached was a photo of Tamara's house, taken from the backyard. My stomach clenched. Lansing's goons were shifting focus, from me to her. I drove faster than I should have, tires squealing as I rounded corners and ran stop signs. When I reached Tamara's place, her front door was open. I rushed inside, gun drawn. "Tamara?" I called out. No answer. Furniture was overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor. There were signs of a struggle, but no blood. Then I heard it. A muffled cry from the hallway closet. I yanked the door open to find Tamara tied up, duct tape on her mouth, eyes wide with terror. I pulled it off carefully and cut the cords around her wrists. "They were here," she whispered, sobbing. "They said I needed to stop helping you, or next time they wouldn't be so gentle." I wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, rage simmering just below my skin. "They're scared," I told her. "That's why they're escalating." Her hands trembled. "What do we do now?" I stood up, every nerve in my body humming. "Now," I said, "now we go to war." By morning, I had a plan and a growing list of enemies. Karen had shown her hand, but it was Lansing who'd stacked the deck. He'd turned federal tools into personal weapons and aimed them at anyone who dared oppose him. That kind of corruption doesn't just disappear. It spreads, infects, roots deep. I needed exposure, public, loud, the kind you couldn't clean up with an apology and a quiet resignation, the kind that made people ask questions. So, I called in my biggest favor. Her name was Mila Reddick, an investigative journalist who'd made enemies in every branch of government and won awards for it. She hated dirty power even more than I did, and I knew if I could get her the right story, she'd drag it into the sunlight whether it screamed or not. She picked up on the second ring. "Is this about the HOA cop nonsense I saw trending yesterday?" she asked before I could say a word. "I've got the real story. Karen's just the mouthpiece. Her uncle's the architect." There was a beat of silence, then, "I'm listening." I didn't give her everything, not over the phone, but enough to whet her appetite. Federal surveillance abuses, neighborhood intimidation, fraudulent law enforcement, and the risk of a cover-up inside the FBI. We arranged to meet that night at a diner 2 counties over. Neutral ground. I didn't want her followed, and I definitely didn't want anyone knowing Tamara was still with me, hidden at a friend's cabin in the woods. As I killed time that afternoon, I went back through the copies of Roger's files, highlighting keywords, assembling a timeline, building a map of influence. Every time Karen issued a fake citation, Lansing's shadow network expanded. It was all about leverage, getting good people to break under the pressure, bend, comply. But what stood out most was something Roger had almost missed. Centurion Neighborhood Services wasn't a one-off. They had sister companies, 5 of them, all operating under different names in different states, same executive board, same contractors, different facades, churches, schools, even a housing project in D.C. It was a system, and it was growing. When I finally walked into the diner, Mila was already seated in a corner booth, sipping black coffee and wearing the same leather jacket she'd had since her first byline broke a congressman's career. "You look like hell," she said without looking up. "Thanks," I replied. "You still chain-smoke clove cigarettes and punch people who touch your notes? Only on weekends." I slid into the booth and handed over the thumb drive. "Everything's on there: files, audio, internal memos, citations, even the arrest footage from the community center." She plugged it into her tablet and began scrolling. Her face changed within minutes, eyebrows narrowing, lips tightening. This is bigger than Karen," she said quietly. "This is a federal-level RICO case waiting to happen." I nodded. "But we need more. One good story, maybe we slow them down. But we don't stop it unless we rip the whole network apart." Mila looked up. "I'll run the piece, full spread, anonymous sources if you want, or name and badge if you're feeling brave." "I want my badge cleared," I said, "and Tamara protected." She considered it. "Done, but there's going to be blowback. You ready for that?" I leaned back, exhaling. "Been living in it for weeks." She gave me a crooked smile. "You always were the stubborn one." After we parted, I parked on a quiet overlook outside the city and watched the skyline fade into dusk. My phone buzzed, this time the burner. I answered, expecting another threat, but it was Alvarez. "They're moving fast," he said. "Karen made bail. Lansing's lawyers are already working to seal the arrest. You need to act now." "I already did," I said. "You'll see the fallout by morning." And he did, because the next day, Mila's story dropped. Front page, full color. Shadow HOA, how federal power was weaponized in America's suburbs. It exploded like a grenade. By noon, Karen's name was trending across every platform. Parents pulled their kids from schools contracted by Centurion. Neighborhoods canceled security agreements. Politicians distanced themselves, and for the first time, Lansing's name was mentioned in public alongside the word criminal. But the war wasn't over. At 3:42 p.m., a black SUV pulled up outside my hideaway cabin. Not a knock, not a call, just the quiet sound of a drone overhead and the faint click of a camera lens zooming in through the treetops. I stepped outside slowly, hand on my hip. The SUV rolled down its tinted window. Inside sat a man in a gray suit, no expression, no ID. "Agent," he said coolly, "you're interfering with national operations. Cease and desist immediately, or face internal prosecution." I stared him down. "You really want to drag this into court? Because I promise you, I've got more files ready to drop. Every hour. On the hour." He blinked once. "Careful," he said. "There are still lines you can't cross." I smiled. "Funny, that's exactly what Karen said." And then I walked back inside. Because sometimes the only way to stop a storm is to become one. I didn't sleep that night. The SUV didn't leave either. It just idled out there in the dark, its windows reflecting the stars like black mirrors. A silent message. "We see you. We're watching." But I didn't care. The story had legs now, and Mila was already setting up interviews with former Centurion employees. One of them, a whistleblower named Theo, claimed he'd been forced to shred complaint forms and falsify reports on residents who refused to comply with fake HOA fines. Tamara stayed off-grid. I made sure of it. She was still shaken, but she knew now that speaking up had mattered, and her statement to Alvarez was already being reviewed by a local prosecutor who wasn't under Lansing's TT. Around 5 a.m., the SUV finally rolled away, headlights cutting a pale trail into the woods. I watched it vanish and exhaled. That was the last quiet moment I'd have for a while. By noon, Karen went on damage control. She did an interview on a fringe podcast hosted by someone who thought the moon landing was faked and HOA fees were a form of communism. Her face was pale, her tone tight, and she tried to spin the story like she was the victim of a government smear campaign. "I just wanted safety," she whined, "but they turned on me, twisted everything." It didn't land, not with Mila's article still being picked apart by every major news outlet. Not when footage from the community center, me flashing my badge and Alvarez cuffing her, was already a viral meme. Fake HOA Karen gets FBI'd. The internet has a short attention span, but it loves a spectacle, and Karen had become one. Still, Lansing hadn't shown his face. No interviews, no statements, nothing. That meant he was still dangerous, planning, pulling strings behind closed doors, the way corrupt power always does. So, I made a move of my own. I went to the press conference. It was organized by a bipartisan council reviewing civilian oversight abuses in residential communities, a fancy way of saying, "We're tired of fake cops shaking down homeowners." Mila had gotten me an invite as a protected source, but when I showed up, every eye turned toward me like I'd brought the storm in with me. The room was packed, reporters, legal experts, former victims, even a few senators pretending they hadn't helped fund Centurion's expansion in the past. I walked to the podium, took a breath, and looked out over the sea of cameras. "My name is Agent Callum Rains. I've worked for the FBI for 11 years, specializing in fraud, enforcement overreach, and interagency corruption. And I'm here to say, on record, that we said this. We missed all of this." The room went still. Karen's fake HOA police weren't just some petty power trip. They were part of a larger structure designed to exploit suburban fear and enforce control through illegal means. Fake citations, false threats, surveillance, and worse, the network reached into federal law enforcement. I saw it, I reported it, and I was punished for it. The murmur started low, but it grew fast. I held up a folder. "Inside here is proof. Correspondence between Karen and Centurion. payment records, contractor lists, even directives signed by Lansing, then deputy director, ordering delays in internal investigations related to neighborhood complaints. I dropped the bomb. Lansing didn't just ignore this corruption. He built it, protected it, weaponized it. Chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameramen jostled for better shots. Someone in the back screamed, "How deep does it go?" But I didn't answer. I just handed the folder to the oversight chair and walked off the stage. That night, the walls finally cracked. Lansing issued a vague statement about internal reviews and misunderstandings, but no one bought it. Not when Mila published the leaked documents showing he'd personally approved funding to expand Centurion's reach into 3 other states. By morning, the Senate called for a special hearing. Subpoenas were issued. And Karen? She vanished, skipped bail, left her house in the middle of the night. Her lawyer claimed she was being harassed and needed time to regain her peace. But the reality was simpler. She was running scared, probably hiding in one of Lansing's safe houses, waiting to see if his power could still protect her. I didn't care. Because I had momentum now. Truth was out. And the people who'd suffered under Karen's reign were finally stepping forward, dozens of them. Seniors threatened with foreclosure, single moms fined for letting their kids draw wit. Chalk on sidewalks. Veterans told they couldn't fly flags on their porches without permits. It was bigger than one neighborhood. It was an epidemic. And now it had a name. Centurion, the symbol of order and control, turned into a mask for fear. I wasn't done, not even close. Because you don't clean rot by cutting the branch. You burn the tree. The investigation picked up speed like a brush fire in high wind. Once the Centurion documents were made public, more agents started asking questions, including some who'd been sitting on suspicious incident reports for months, too afraid or too disinterested to connect the dots. But now, the dots were glowing red. Alvarez got reassigned to a task force looking into private enforcement contracts nationwide. He called me the day after Karen skipped bail. "They think she's in Nevada," he said. "Desert property, off the grid, but no official warrant yet." "Because Lansing's still blocking it?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He hesitated, then sighed. "It's worse." He resigned. That stunned me for a moment. He what? Effective immediately, no hearings, no public apology, just gone. I sank into my chair. That was Lansing's move, vanish before the hammer fell, leaving a mess behind him like a ghost in a hurricane. No accountability, just silence and shredded documents. But resignation meant fear, and fear meant weakness. "They're scrambling," I muttered, "which means we press harder." And we did. Over the next 2 weeks, stories poured in. Communities from California to Florida reported Centurion officers patrolling private neighborhoods, issuing fake citations, even detaining residents who didn't comply with manufactured infractions. In some cases, they impersonated local law enforcement, complete with fake uniforms and forged warrants. It was deeper than I thought, more organized and darker. Maya. La and I met in person at a quiet coffee shop in Arlington. She looked tired, sleepless nights chasing leads, but her eyes were sharp. "You know they're going to try to bury this, right?" she said. "Centurion's got too many ex-military brass on its board, and now with Lansing gone, there's no clean villain for Congress to point at." I nodded grimly. "Which is why we go public again." She raised an eyebrow. "What else have you got?" I pulled out a USB stick and slid it across the table. "Audio recording, from the night before the community center meeting." Her eyes widened. "That when they tried to flip Tamara?" "No," I said. "It's what came after. Someone left this in my mailbox." I paused. Karen's voice. And someone else. Male. Probably Lansing. They were arguing, planning the takedown. Mila plugged it into her laptop and put in earbuds. I watched her face go from curiosity to disbelief to fury in under a minute. When she finally looked back up, her voice was low. "This is the final nail." "Then drive it," I said. Hard. She did. The article dropped the next day with a headline that screamed across the internet. The fake HOA police were real, and the FBI helped build them. Within hours, it was trending everywhere. Not just Reddit and Twitter, but cable news, late-night shows, even international outlets. Karen became a symbol of small-time tyranny. Lansing, the architect behind the curtain. Whistleblowers flooded in. A former Centurion trainer described boot camp sessions where recruits were told to walk like cops, talk like cops, but never say you're cops. One internal memo even outlined steps for escalating confrontations to provoke probable cause if residents resisted HOA orders. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. The DOJ had no choice but to step in. A special counsel was announced. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe something permanent might actually change. But hope doesn't last long in my line of work, especially not when your phone rings at 3 a.m. "Rains?" came Alvarez's voice, tight and clipped. "I'm here. They found Karen." My stomach tightened. "Alive?" He paused. "Barely. The safe house in Nevada had been torched. She'd been inside, burns over 60% of her body, but still breathing when emergency crews arrived. The arson looked professional. No prints, no surveillance, no witnesses. They wanted her gone," I said. "She was a liability," Alvarez agreed. "And Lansing's cleaning house." Silence stretched between us like static. "Do we have anything that ties him to the hit?" I asked. "Not yet, but I'm working it." I hung up and stared at the ceiling. Karen was no hero. She'd bullied, blackmailed, and terrorized people. But even she didn't deserve that kind of end, not as someone used and discarded by bigger players. And Lansing, he was still out there, still pulling strings, still dangerous. The public thought it was over, that Karen's fall was the final chapter, but I knew better. This story didn't end with viral headlines and Senate hearings. It ended in shadows, where men like Lansing built empires under the guise of order. So I dug in again. No badge, no orders. Just me, the evidence, and the burning truth. Karen was the face, but Lansing was the fist, and I wasn't done swinging. In the end, Karen's empire crumbled under the weight of its own deception. Her charred survival turned her from tyrant to tragic footnote. Her face splashed across news outlets as the cautionary tale of power unchecked. The fake HOA police vanished into legal oblivion, their contracts voided, their uniforms seized as evidence. The neighborhood, once quiet and naive, awoke to reality. Real HOA elections were held, this time with transparency. Tamara joined the new board, her voice no longer trembling, but firm with purpose. People started waving at each other again, not out of fear, but out of relief. Alvarez got promoted, quietly but deservedly. Mila's expose won her a journalism award, and enemies in high places. Lansing, of course, disappeared like smoke. No charges, no press conference, just a name redacted in every official document we requested. As for me, I kept my badge, but more importantly, I kept my integrity. Walking past those trimmed lawns and polished mailboxes, I understood something most agents never get to see. The fight for justice doesn't always happen in courtrooms or war zones. Sometimes it happens in cul-de-sacs, across fences, under porch lights, against enemies who don't wear masks, but smiles. And when they come knocking again, I'll be ready.